Okay, here's the last part 4 of the supplementary lecture for Chapter 7, Urban Sociology. Now, in the home stretch, the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is poverty. We're going to talk about it in the U.S. We're also going to talk about poverty a little bit on a global level. You have relative poverty. This is the lack of resources of some in relation to those who have more. Then we can talk about absolute poverty, the lack of resources that is actually life-threatening. Poverty is a relative thing. The poorest person in the United States, or when we look at poor people in the U.S., probably, for the most part, have it way better than the poorest people in third world countries or developing countries. Oops, sorry about that. Get this back on track here. So the poorest people in the United States are probably better off than the poorest people in, let's say, Africa or parts of India. Poor people in this country still have access to some food, to clothing, to shelter for the most part. And again, there are exceptions to that. Can you imagine not having food, not having clothes, having nowhere to live? Absolute poverty. So you're so poor, your life is literally in danger. Then we could talk about the feminization of poverty, which is the trend of women comprising an increasing proportion of the poor. And we'll talk more about that here in just a second. How about right now? Here's some more on women and poverty in the U.S. In 1960, 25% of all poor households were headed by women. In 2001, 51% of poor households were headed by women. In 2004, still 51%. If you want another example of a statistic, in 1980, women earned approximately 60 cents for every male dollar for doing exactly the same job. In 2008, women were earning 77 cents for every male dollar for doing exactly the same job. That number is now at about 81 cents. So when we look at why more women are poor than men, there are a lot of social reasons for that. Generally, when there are children in a relationship and the relationship dissolves, women are the ones taking care of the children. The children live with the mothers generally. Moms are incurring the day-to-day expenses. Even if the fathers are providing money or child support, they're still paying for a lot of what their children are doing, their activities, their food, their clothing, and they're working just as much as men, making less money doing it on top of that. So you can see why very quickly, the way society is structured, you can see where more women might be poor than men. Worldwide, 1 out of 6 people live at or below the poverty level. That's alarming. In our country, it's not 1 out of 6. It's not even close to that. But worldwide, poverty is a much bigger problem. Poverty is difficult to define, so I decided to go to the United States Census Bureau to try to give us sort of quantifiable data in terms of coming up with a definition for poor. We all know someone, if we see someone on the street and they're begging and they're homeless, we get an idea of what poor looks like or feels like. But this gives you some numbers. Now, these numbers a little outdated. These come from 2007 census data, but it's going to give you an idea. In 2007, you were defined by the government as being poor if you were a family of 3, let's say a mom, a dad, and 1 child. If you made above $16,689, if you made $17,000 a year, you were not considered to be poor, and therefore you could miss out on some pretty significant benefits from the government. If you made less than that, less than $16,689, you were defined by the government as being poor. Well, let's go down to the bottom number, $41,000. How many of you would like to start off out of college making $41,691 a year? You might think it's not a bad starting point, but think of this in terms of a family of 9. You've got a mom, you got a dad, or you've got 2 parents, whatever, and 7 kids. And now after taxes, you might be looking at about $30,000 really after taxes, if that. Now, is it going to be possible for a family of 9 to live on $30,000 a year in 2007? It's going to be very, very difficult. But if you make a dollar above that, you are not defined as being poor. So it's tough. It would be tough to live on that. Poverty and age. A lot of people are quick to look at those in the lower social classes and blame them. Well, it's your fault. You're poor. Get a job. Go to school. Get a degree. Do this. Do that. Well, and for some it might be that simple. Maybe they're just not motivated, or maybe they just don't care. Again, that is the exception and not the rule. Here's the problem. Most people who are poor in this country aren't adults. but are children who can't make really any decisions about income, or they can't really help themselves get up out of their situations because they're powerless to do so when they're children. In 2001, 16.3% of poor people were under the age of 18 or were children. In 2004, 17.8% of poor people in this country were under the age of 18. If you fast forward that to today, it's right at 18. Depending on what numbers you're looking at and how you define it, you're looking at 18 to 18.5% of poor people under the age of 18. Childhood poverty rates are the highest among minorities, especially African American children. So again, children comprise the largest portion of the poor population in this country, who are largely powerless to do anything about it until they become of age. And then there are still problems because of their backgrounds and their histories. Race and ethnicity. You can see it. In 2001, 22.7% of African Americans were poor. That's a lot, and that's an alarming statistic. If you fast forward to 2004, 24.5%. So that number actually went up from 2001 to 2004, as opposed to Caucasians, those who are considered to be more privileged, if you will, within our society. 7.8% of Caucasians were poor in 2001, 8.6% in 2004. So African Americans and Latinos, much larger proportions of those populations are poor than Asians or Caucasians. And the last slide, and we'll talk briefly about two basic views of poverty. I've kind of alluded to them, but I haven't really given them names. You have subcultural views of poverty, and you have structural views of poverty. And this is the last slide that we'll have on here. Yep. Subcultural views of poverty, basically you're blaming the poor. Basically, we're looking at people in the lower class and the poor class and saying, well, do something about it. You know, get a job, get up, get out of where you're living. If it's in a poor, rundown inner city, you know, move out to the suburbs or do something differently. While some can, most probably cannot do that. Again, especially if you have a lot of children involved. Families in lower classes, remember, tend to have bigger families. They produce more children. Those children are powerless to do anything about that. Even if they want to and are smart enough and are motivated, adults who are poor often don't have the money or the means to improve their lives. But it is kind of easy to look at people sometimes and blame them for their position in life. Structural views of poverty more or less blame society or look at the way society is structured. The example that I always give was structural views of poverty. I had a client who he was an inmate, and he was living in Chicago, Illinois. He was working at Burger King. He had 8 kids, which is another story for another day. But he had 8 children, and he wasn't, living with all of them, but he was trying to provide child support, and he was really trying to do it the right way. Working 60 hours a week at Burger King, all the overtime he could get, still wasn't even scratching the surface. Couldn't pay his bills. He couldn't make his child support payments. So he basically threw his hands in the air and gave up. Because he thought, what can I do? The harder I work, the more I can't pay my bills, the more I can't take care of my kids. And people looked at this guy, called him a loser, called him lazy, unintelligent, all these things. But really the way his environment was structured, and then there were no jobs, there were no opportunities in his neighborhood to go to school. The public schools were a mess. There was no scholarship funding. His environment probably had a lot to do with his position in life and the way he turned out. So we could kind of look at it either way. And I know it says other factors as they relate to poverty. We're not going to really cover that here. But those are the two basic ways to kind of view poverty. And we'll play around with these terms in class as well as we get in more into Chapter 7. So we'll call that the very end of the supplementary lecture series on social stratification. Thank you.